The bus doors opened with a sharp hiss, releasing a puff of warm air that mixed with the biting cold of the night. Jake scanned the deserted street as he turned off the engine. His shift was over, and he was eager to head back to the shelter and rest. But something caught his attention. On the bench at the bus stop, a small figure sat motionless. He squinted, adjusting his worn cap to get a better look. It was a child, alone. Jake felt a pang in his chest. He stepped down the bus stairs slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, trying not to startle her. "Hey, are you okay?" His voice was low but steady. There was no response. The dim street lamp illuminated the girl, revealing her disheveled hair and a coat far too large for her slight frame. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, thin, with a distant look in her eyes. A quiet sob broke the heavy silence. "Are you waiting for someone?" Jake tried again, crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. She shook her head, pulling her knees closer to her chest. Jake hesitated for a moment before pulling a wrapped sandwich from his pocket. "Look, I know it's not much, but it's fresh. Want some?" The girl slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes, a deep blue, were wet with tears. After a moment of hesitation, she reached out and took the sandwich. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jake smiled gently, hoping to reassure her. "What's your name?" "Ava," she whispered. "Hi, Ava. I'm Jake. I drive that bus over there." He pointed with his thumb toward the parked vehicle. "Do you know where you live? Someone must be looking for you." "No," she said quickly, her gaze dropping. "No one's looking for me." Jake fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. There was something heavier in that statement than a child her age should carry. He took a deep breath. "Okay, Ava, but I can't leave you out here alone. How about coming with me? I can get you someplace warm to stay tonight." She hesitated, but eventually nodded. Jake picked up her small, battered backpack and helped her onto the bus. Jake's shelter was in an old building downtown, the kind of place that smelled of aged wood and forgotten history. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and organized, with simple furniture he had managed to gather over the years. He opened the door and switched on the light, revealing a cozy room with a worn sofa and a tiny kitchen in the corner. "It's not much, but it's better than the street," he said, shrugging off his jacket and hanging it over a chair. Ava stepped in cautiously, clutching her backpack as if it were a shield. "You can sleep on the couch," he offered, pulling a blanket from a cabinet. "Want some tea?" "I don't have hot chocolate, but I can make something close enough." Ava nodded faintly, sitting on the edge of the sofa with her knees pulled up. Jake prepared a cup of tea with milk and sugar, placing it on the table in front of her. "Here, it'll warm you up." She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Jake pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" "My dad disappeared," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Without looking at him, Jake blinked, caught off guard. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "He left. They said he's not coming back," she replied, her voice heavy with sadness. Jake scratched the back of his neck, unsure of how to respond. The pain in her voice was palpable, and he knew questions wouldn't help right now. "I'm sorry, Ava. That must be really hard," she shrugged, staring into the mug as if it held the answers to her troubles. Jake decided to change the subject. "Do you like anything? School, games, something that makes you smile?" Ava lifted her eyes for the first time, her expression almost curious. "I like math. My dad said I was really good at it." Jake smiled. "Math, huh? I was terrible at it. But it sounds like you've got a real talent." She gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible, before retreating back into herself. Jake sensed there was a wall around her, a story she wasn't ready to share. He didn't push. The next morning, Jake decided to try and sort out the situation. He took Ava to the local police station, but the experience was disheartening. The officer on duty seemed more interested in his coffee than in the girl's story. Without concrete information, "There's not much we can do," he said indifferently. Jake left the station with Ava by his side, a mix of frustration and helplessness simmering inside him. "Well, that wasn't very helpful," he muttered, trying to lighten the mood. Ava just shrugged. As they walked back, he noticed that Ava was starting to trust him, even if she didn't say it out loud. It was in her small gestures, the way she followed him without hesitation. Jake decided that, for now, she'd stay with him. He didn't know how, but he would figure something out for her. That night, Ava woke up from a nightmare, her quiet sobs filling the small room. Jake heard her and quickly got up, sitting beside her on the couch. "It's okay, Ava. It was just a bad dream." She threw her arms around him suddenly, holding him tightly. Jake was startled, but wrapped his arms around her in return. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving me." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. He knew his life was already complicated, but something about Ava made him want to be more, to do more. As she drifted back to sleep, he sat staring out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, but all he could see was the responsibility he now carried. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: this journey was only just beginning. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the cracks in the old window, casting long shadows across the small room. Jake stirred from the creaky armchair where he had spent the night, his back aching. Ava was still curled up on the sofa, the oversized blanket draped over her like a cocoon. She looked peaceful for the first time since he had met her, but the faint lines of worry on her young face hadn't faded completely. Jake got up quietly and shuffled to the kitchen. As he put a kettle on the stove, his mind raced. He couldn't just keep her here indefinitely. Someone had to be missing her, right? But the way she had spoken the night before, her quiet admission that no one was looking for her, gnawed at him. What kind of world left a child like Ava abandoned? When Ava woke up, the smell of toasted bread greeted her. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and looked toward the small kitchen. Jake was standing there, his broad back hunched as he spread butter on a piece of toast. For a moment, she just watched him, uncertain. The scene felt alien, like a memory that didn't belong to her. "Good morning," Jake said, turning to her with a smile. "Hope you're hungry." "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." She nodded hesitantly, her stomach growling despite her nerves. Jake brought over a plate with toast and scrambled eggs, setting it on the small coffee table in front of her. "Eat up," he said, sitting on the chair across from her. "We've got a busy day ahead." "Busy with what?" Ava asked softly, picking at the edge of the toast. "Well," Jake began, "we need to figure out how to help you. Maybe someone at a community center or church could help us get in touch with anyone you know." Ava shook her head quickly, her grip tightening on the toast. "I don't want to go back." Jake frowned but stayed quiet, letting her speak at her own pace. "They don't care about me," she whispered, staring at her plate. "My dad's gone. And the others. They just don't care." Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Who are the others?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her small hands trembling slightly. "It doesn't matter," she muttered. "I just don't want to go back." Jake's heart ached for her, but he knew pressing her would only make things worse. "Okay," he said, leaning back. "We won't do anything you don't want to do. But we've got to figure something out, Ava. You can't stay in limbo forever." Jake decided to take Ava to the local community center. It wasn't much, just a small building tucked between a laundromat and a thrift store, but it was a hub for people who needed help. The woman at the front desk, a kind but overworked volunteer, listened to Jake's story with a sympathetic nod. "I wish we could do more," she said, her voice apologetic. "But without any documents or information, there's not much we can do. You'd have to go through child services." Jake stiffened. He had heard too many horror stories about the system to trust it. He glanced at Ava, who was clutching his jacket sleeve tightly, her wide eyes filled with silent fear. "We'll figure something else out," Jake said curtly, steering Ava back toward the door. "Wait," the woman called after them. She handed Jake a flyer. "There's a local charity that helps kids in tough situations. They might be able to offer some guidance." Jake nodded, tucking the flyer into his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, as they sat in the quiet shelter, Ava spoke up. "Why are you helping me?" Jake looked up from the newspaper he was pretending to read. "Why wouldn't I?" he replied. You don't know me, she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. I could be lying, Jake chuckled softly, folding the paper and setting it aside. Maybe you are, he said, but I don't think you are. And even if you were, a kid shouldn't be out there alone. That's not right. Ava studied him for a moment, as if trying to decode his intentions. Finally, she said, my dad used to say people like you don't exist anymore. Jake's smile faded slightly. People like me? People who care, she said simply. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. Well, he said finally, your dad sounds like a smart guy, but maybe he just didn't meet the right people. Ava didn't respond, but she seemed to relax a little, her posture less guarded. Later that night, as Ava slept, Jake pulled the flyer from his pocket and studied it. The charity listed on the paper looked legitimate, and the description mentioned offering support for kids in crisis. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ava's story than she was letting on. Her mention of her father stuck with him. She had spoken of him with such reverence, but also with a sadness that felt too heavy for someone her age. Jake wondered what kind of man her father had been and why Ava seemed so convinced he wasn't coming back. He glanced at Ava, her small form curled up on the sofa. She was vulnerable, but there was something about her, a quiet resilience, a spark of determination. Jake couldn't explain it, but he felt an unshakable sense of responsibility for her. Whatever had happened to her, whoever she was running from, Jake knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Jake stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a steaming cup of coffee, his mind racing. Ava was still asleep, her small form curled under the blanket on the sofa. The events of the past 2 days played in his head like a loop, her trembling voice, the haunted look in her eyes, the weight of her words. My dad's gone. He opened the newspaper he had picked up that morning, more out of habit than interest. As he flipped the pages, a faint rustle behind him drew his attention. Ava stood in the doorway, her oversized coat draped over her shoulders like a shield. Morning, sleepyhead, Jake greeted, his voice warm. Ava gave him a faint smile, her eyes still clouded by the remnants of whatever nightmares haunted her. Morning, I've got cereal or toast, Jake offered, gesturing toward the small cupboard. Your pick, cereal's fine, she replied, sitting at the small table. She watched him move around the kitchen, her curiosity growing. It was the first time in a long while that someone had gone out of their way to care for her. As Jake set the bowl in front of her, he noticed her staring at the open newspaper. She pointed to a section filled with numbers. What's that? That? Jake chuckled. That's the Sudoku puzzle. It's supposed to be fun, but I've never been able to figure it out. Ava's interest piqued. Can I try? Be my guest, Jake said, sliding the paper toward her. He watched as she hunched over the puzzle, her small hands gripping a pencil. Within minutes, she had filled in several boxes, her focus intense. Jake leaned over her shoulder, astonished. You're kidding me. You actually understand that? It's just patterns, Ava said, shrugging. My dad used to make me do harder ones. Jake's brow furrowed. Your dad taught you that? Yeah, she said, her voice softening. He loved math and science. He used to say numbers could solve anything. Jake filed that piece of information away, sensing it might be important. Your dad sounds like a smart guy. He was, Ava said, her voice tinged with sadness. Later that day, Jake decided to dig a little deeper. Ava had mentioned her father, but the details were sparse. Something about her story didn't sit right with him. He walked to the local library while Ava stayed at the shelter, promising she wouldn't leave. In the library, he sifted through old newspapers and archives, searching for any mention of a missing man or a family that fit Ava's description. After an hour, his persistence paid off. A headline caught his eye. Dr. William Harris, local scientist, reported missing. Jake read the article, his heart pounding. Dr. Harris was a well-known figure in the community, a scientist who had worked on groundbreaking projects. The article mentioned that he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a daughter. The name in the report was blurred by age, but Jake knew it had to be Ava. He snapped a photo of the article with his phone and hurried back to the shelter. Chapter 3. Traces of the past. Jake stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a steaming cup of coffee, his mind racing. Ava was still asleep, her small form curled under the blanket on the sofa. The events of the past 2 days played in his head like a loop, her trembling voice, the haunted look in her eyes, the weight of her words. My dad's gone. He opened the newspaper he had picked up that morning, more out of habit than interest. As he flipped the pages, a faint rustle behind him drew his attention. Ava stood in the doorway, her oversized coat draped over her shoulders like a shield. Morning, sleepyhead, Jake greeted, his voice warm. Ava gave him a faint smile, her eyes still clouded by the remnants of whatever nightmares haunted her. Morning, I've got cereal or toast, Jake offered, gesturing toward the small cupboard. Your pick. Cereal's fine, she replied, sitting at the small table. She watched him move around the kitchen, her curiosity growing. It was the first time in a long while that someone had gone out of their way to care for her. As Jake set the bowl in front of her, he noticed her staring at the open newspaper. She pointed to a section filled with numbers. What's that? That? Jake chuckled. That's the Sudoku puzzle. It's supposed to be fun, but I've never been able to figure it out. Ava's interest peaked. Can I try? Be my guest, Jake said, sliding the paper toward her. He watched as she hunched over the puzzle, her small hands gripping a pencil. Within minutes, she had filled in several boxes, her focus intense. Jake leaned over her shoulder, astonished. You're kidding me. You actually understand that? It's just patterns, Ava said, shrugging. My dad used to make me do harder ones. Jake's brow furrowed. Your dad taught you that? Yeah, she said, her voice softening. He loved math and science. He used to say numbers could solve anything. Jake filed that piece of information away, sensing it might be important. Your dad sounds like a smart guy. He was, Ava said, her voice tinged with sadness. Later that day, Jake decided to dig a little deeper. Ava had mentioned her father, but the details were sparse. Something about her story didn't sit right with him. He walked to the local library while Ava stayed at the shelter, promising she wouldn't leave. In the library, he sifted through old newspapers and archives, searching for any mention of a missing man or a family that fit Ava's description. After an hour, his persistence paid off. A headline caught his eye. Dr. William Harris, local scientist, reported missing. Jake read the article, his heart pounding. Dr. Harris was a well-known figure in the community, a scientist who had worked on groundbreaking projects. The article mentioned that he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a daughter. The name in the report was blurred by age, but Jake knew it had to be Ava. He snapped a photo of the article with his phone and hurried back to the shelter. Ava was sitting cross-legged on the floor when Jake returned, flipping through an old magazine he had lying around. She looked up as he walked in, sensing his urgency. What is it? She asked. Jake hesitated. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but she deserved to know. Ava, your dad, was he a scientist? Her face lit up briefly, then dimmed as she nodded. Yeah. Why? Jake sat down across from her, holding out his phone to show her the article. I found this. Is this him? Ava's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. That's him, she whispered, her fingers brushing the image. That's my dad. Jake leaned back, letting her process the information. Ava, this says he disappeared. Do you know anything about that? She looked away, biting her lip. They told me he wasn't coming back, she said finally. But I don't think that's true. He wouldn't just leave me. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. There was more to this story than he had imagined. Who told you that, Ava? She hesitated, her eyes filling with uncertainty. The people at the house. They said he had to go away for work, but I heard them talking once. They said he wasn't safe anymore. Not safe? Jake repeated, his voice low. What do you mean? I don't know, Ava admitted. I think they're lying. Jake's mind raced. The mention of her father's disappearance and the cryptic comments she overheard painted a troubling picture. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ava was right. Someone wasn't telling the truth. That evening, Jake sat at the small table with a notebook, jotting down everything he had learned. Ava's father, Dr. William Harris, had been involved in something significant. The mention of safety and lies hinted at something larger, something dangerous. As Ava slept on the sofa, Jake stared at the article again, his eyes lingering on the blurred details. His instincts told him this wasn't just about a missing father. Whatever Dr. Harris had been working on, it was big enough to put both him and his daughter at risk. Jake glanced at Ava, her small frame curled under the blanket. She deserved answers, and he was determined to find them. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to form a picture, one thing became clear. They were stepping into dangerous territory. The first knock came late at night, faint but deliberate. Jake froze, his hand gripping the notebook where he'd been jotting down notes about Ava's father. His heart quickened as he glanced toward the sofa, where Ava was sleeping soundly, her small figure curled under a blanket. The knock came again, louder this time. Jake stood, his mind racing. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially at this hour. Stepping cautiously to the door, he peered through the peephole. A man in a dark coat stood on the dimly lit porch, his face obscured by the shadow of a hat. Jake's instincts flared. Whoever this was, they weren't here for a friendly visit. He opened the door just a crack, his voice firm. "Can I help you?" "Good evening," the man said, his tone clipped and professional. "I'm looking for someone." "A little girl, dark hair, blue eyes. Have you seen anyone fitting the description?" Jake's grip on the door tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice steady. "It's late. You should go." The man's expression didn't waver. "If you see anything unusual, it's in your best interest to report it." He slipped a card through the gap in the door before turning and walking away. Jake locked the door, his pulse pounding. He picked up the card and read it. Ethan Carter, private investigator. No contact information, just the name. Jake. Ava's voice came softly from the sofa. She was sitting up now, rubbing her eyes. "It's nothing," Jake said quickly, tucking the card into his pocket. "Just someone asking for directions. Go back to sleep." Ava studied him for a moment, but didn't press further. She lay back down, pulling the blanket over her head. The next morning, Jake sat at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at the card. Something wasn't right. Who was this investigator, and why was he looking for Ava? His gut told him it was connected to her father, to the project Dr. Harris had been working on before his disappearance. Ava wandered into the kitchen, her coat still draped over her shoulders like armor. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Your dad," Jake admitted. "The more I learn, the less it makes sense." "You said he was working on something important, right?" Ava nodded, her eyes clouding with sadness. "He never told me what it was. Just that it would change a lot of things." Jake's mind churned. A scientist working on something groundbreaking, disappearing under mysterious circumstances, and now strangers showing up asking questions. It was all connected. "But how?" "I think we need help," Jake said finally. "Someone who knows more about your dad and what he was working on." Jake remembered an old friend, Michael, a retired cop who had always had a knack for uncovering hidden truths. If anyone could help, it was him. That afternoon, Jake and Ava took a bus to Michael's modest house on the outskirts of the city. Michael greeted them with a wary look, but ushered them inside after Jake explained the basics of the situation. The older man listened carefully, his sharp eyes narrowing as Jake described the visitor from the night before. "This isn't random," Michael said, leaning back in his chair. "Ava's father must have been involved in something big. If someone's looking for her, it's because they think she knows something or she's leverage." Ava fidgeted in her seat, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know anything," she said quietly. Michael leaned forward. "Maybe not, kid, but you're important to someone, or they wouldn't be looking this hard." Jake nodded grimly. "What do we do?" Michael tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. "First, you need to keep her out of sight. Whoever this investigator is, he's not working alone. Second, we need to figure out what her dad was working on. That's the key to all of this." Back at the shelter, Jake and Ava pored over the notes he had made and the article about Dr. Harris. One detail stood out, a reference to a lab where Dr. Harris had conducted much of his research. If they could find it, they might uncover more about his disappearance and why Ava was being sought after. As they worked, Jake noticed Ava's unease growing. "What's on your mind, kid?" he asked gently. "I remember something," she said hesitantly. "The night before he disappeared, my dad told me to memorize some numbers. He said they were important." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Do you remember them?" Ava nodded. "I didn't know what they meant, but I never forgot. 1204-1537. Jake jotted the numbers down. "This could be a code, coordinates, anything," he said, his mind racing. "Good job remembering, Ava." For the first time in days, she smiled faintly, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. Later that night, as Jake locked up the shelter, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The quiet street seemed too quiet, the shadows too deep. He pulled the curtains tight and double-checked the locks before settling into his armchair, his eyes scanning the room. Ava slept soundly on the sofa, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. Jake promised himself he wouldn't let anything happen to her. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger. Whatever secrets Ava's father had left behind, they were worth pursuing and protecting. This wasn't just about finding Dr. Harris anymore. It was about keeping Ava safe, no matter the cost. The wind whipped through the streets as Jake hurried toward the address Michael had given him. Ava walked by his side, her small frame bundled in her oversized coat. She clutched her backpack tightly, her blue eyes scanning every shadow with quiet apprehension. Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though the tension in his own chest hadn't eased since they left the shelter. Michael had made a few calls after their last meeting and found the name of someone who might know more about Dr. Harris, a former colleague, Dr. Eleanor Grant. She had worked with Harris on some of his most ambitious projects and had left the research abruptly a year before his disappearance. Jake hoped she could provide answers. The building was unremarkable, a modest brick structure tucked between an old bakery and a closed hardware store. Jake knocked twice on the heavy door, the sound echoing down the empty street. After a pause, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her sharp green eyes flicked between Jake and Ava with suspicion. "Dr. Grant?" Jake asked, his voice steady but cautious. She nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" "My name's Jake." "This is Ava," he said, stepping aside to let her see the girl. "We need your help. It's about her father, Dr. William Harris." At the mention of the name, Eleanor's expression shifted from suspicion to alarm. She gestured them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. The interior of the house was sparse but orderly, with stacks of books and papers covering every surface. "You shouldn't be here," she said urgently. "If anyone finds out, we don't have anywhere else to go." Jake interrupted. "Ava's in danger, and it has something to do with her dad. Please, if you know anything, we need to hear it." Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at Ava, who stood quietly by the door. "You look just like him," she murmured before sighing deeply. "All right, sit down." Eleanor made tea as Jake explained everything: Ava's sudden appearance, the strange men asking questions, and the cryptic numbers her father had left her. When he finished, Eleanor sat silently for a moment, her fingers wrapped tightly around her mug. "William was brilliant," she began, her voice tinged with both admiration and regret. "He was working on something revolutionary, a way to harness energy from subatomic particles. Clean, infinite energy. It could have changed the world." Jake leaned forward. "So why did he disappear?" "Because it was dangerous," Eleanor said, her voice heavy. "Not just the science, the people involved. Powerful entities wanted to control it, to weaponize it. William refused, and that's when things started to go wrong." Ava's voice broke the tense silence. "Do you know where he is?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flicking to Jake before returning to Ava. "I don't. But if he's alive, he'll be in hiding." Jake pulled the slip of paper with Ava's numbers from his pocket. He gave her these. "Do they mean anything to you?" Eleanor studied the numbers, her brows furrowing. "It could be a code," she said finally. Coordinates, maybe. Or access to something he left behind. Jake's mind raced. How do we find out? I can help you decode it, Eleanor said, standing. But you have to be careful. If they're looking for Ava, they won't stop. As they worked, Eleanor shared more details about William's research. The project, codenamed Aurora, had attracted attention from private corporations and government agencies alike. William's refusal to hand over his findings had made him a target. If he left something behind for Ava, it's because he trusted her to keep it safe, Eleanor said. You'll need to think like him to figure this out. Hours later, they made a breakthrough. The numbers were indeed coordinates, leading to a remote location on the outskirts of the city. Eleanor printed out a map, circling the spot. What's there? Jake asked. I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But if William wanted you to find it, it's important before they left. Eleanor knelt in front of Ava, her green eyes kind but serious. Listen to me, Ava. Your father loved you more than anything. Whatever he left for you, it's because he believed in you. But there are people who will do anything to get it. You have to trust Jake and stay hidden. Ava nodded solemnly, her small hands clutching the map. I'll be careful. Eleanor looked at Jake. You need to keep moving. The longer you stay in one place, the more danger you're in. Jake nodded, his jaw tight. Thank you, Dr. Grant. Good luck, Eleanor said, opening the door and watching them disappear into the night. Back at the shelter, Jake spread the map on the table while Ava watched from the sofa. The location was in an abandoned industrial area, far from any prying eyes. It was risky, but Jake knew they had no choice. We'll go tomorrow, he said, folding the map. First thing, Ava looked at him, her face pale but determined. Do you think we'll find him? Jake hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think we'll find answers. And that's the first step. As Ava drifted off to sleep, Jake sat by the window, his eyes scanning the quiet street below. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The stakes were rising, and the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. He wouldn't let anything happen to Ava. Whatever lay at those coordinates, it was the key to everything. The morning sun broke weakly through a gray sky as Jake and Ava set off toward the coordinates Dr. Eleanor Grant had deciphered. Jake's battered truck rattled along the desolate road, the tension between them palpable. Ava sat quietly, clutching the map Eleanor had given them, her blue eyes fixed on the horizon. Are you sure about this? Jake asked, glancing at her. Ava nodded, her voice steady despite the apprehension in her expression. If it's something my dad left behind, we have to find it. Jake tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. The road was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow. He knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. The coordinates led them to an abandoned industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Rusted fences and decaying warehouses loomed like skeletons of a forgotten era. Jake parked the truck in the shadow of a large building, cutting the engine. This is it, he said, unfolding the map to confirm the location. Ava climbed out of the truck, her small figure dwarfed by the crumbling structures around her. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake scanned the area. We look for clues. Anything that could tell us what your dad was working on or where he might be. As they searched, Ava spotted a small metal door partially concealed by overgrown vines. Jake, over here, she called. Jake hurried to her side, pulling the vines away to reveal a keypad next to the door. The numbers on the pad made his heart race. 12:04:15:37. Ava, he said, his voice low. This is it. Your dad's code. Ava stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she typed the numbers into the keypad. The door clicked open, revealing a dark stairwell descending into the ground. Jake grabbed a flashlight from the truck and led the way. Ava close behind him. The stairwell opened into a small underground lab. The air was stale, and the faint hum of dormant machinery echoed in the silence. Papers were scattered across a desk, along with blueprints and notebooks filled with complex equations. This must be it, Jake said, scanning the room. Ava wandered to the desk, her eyes widening as she recognized her father's handwriting on the papers. He was here, she whispered, running her fingers over the pages. This is his work. Jake picked up a folder labeled Aurora Protocol. Inside were diagrams and notes, but the language was technical and dense. This looks like some kind of energy project, he said, flipping through the pages. Clean energy, maybe? Ava nodded. He always said he wanted to change the world. As they searched the lab, Jake's instincts prickled. Something wasn't right. The room felt too exposed, too vulnerable. And then he heard a faint sound from above, like a door creaking open. Someone's here, he said sharply, pulling Ava behind him. He extinguished the flashlight, plunging the lab into darkness. Footsteps echoed above them, slow and deliberate. Jake's mind raced. If they were caught, there was no telling what might happen. He scanned the room for a place to hide, spotting a narrow alcove behind a row of old filing cabinets. Quick, in here, he whispered, guiding Ava into the space. They crouched low, their breathing shallow as the footsteps grew louder. A beam of light swept across the lab, pausing briefly on the desk where Ava had been standing. Jake tightened his grip on her shoulder, silently willing her to stay calm. The light lingered for a moment before moving on. The footsteps retreated, the sound fading into the distance. Jake waited several minutes before exhaling, his muscles still tense. Who was that? Ava asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Jake said, his voice low. But we can't stay here. They gathered as many documents as they could carry, stuffing them into a backpack. As they climbed back to the surface, Jake peeked cautiously through the door. The industrial park was quiet again, but he didn't trust it. We need to go, he said, ushering Ava toward the truck. As they drove away, Jake's mind raced. Whoever had been in the lab was looking for the same thing they were. And if they had found the lab, it wouldn't take long for them to come after Ava. That evening, Jake called Michael from a payphone, recounting everything they had found. Michael's voice was tense on the other end of the line. Jake, this is bigger than we thought. If these people are tracking you, they're not going to stop. What do we do? Jake asked, glancing back at Ava, who was sitting quietly in the truck. You need a safe place to lay low, Michael said. I'll make some calls. And Jake, watch your back. These aren't amateurs. Jake hung up, his resolve hardening. He climbed back into the truck, looking at Ava. We'll figure this out, he said firmly. I promise. Ava met his gaze, her expression a mix of fear and trust. I believe you, she said. As the truck rumbled down the dark highway, Jake knew their journey was only becoming more dangerous. But he also knew he couldn't stop. Ava's safety and her father's legacy depended on him. The wind howled through the empty streets as Jake pulled the truck into the driveway of a secluded cabin Michael had arranged for them. Nestled in the dense woods on the outskirts of the city, the cabin was old but sturdy, with a single flickering porch light casting long shadows on the gravel. This will keep us off their radar for a while, Jake said, stepping out of the truck. Ava followed, clutching her backpack, her eyes scanning the dark tree line. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but functional, with a small kitchen, a couch, and a single bedroom. Jake locked the door behind them and closed the curtain. The weight of the past few days was starting to take its toll, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Later that evening, as they sorted through the papers and blueprints from the lab, Ava pointed to a specific page. This is my dad's handwriting, she said, tracing the elegant script. The page was filled with equations and sketches of machinery Jake couldn't begin to understand. What does it mean? He asked. Ava frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. It's a formula. I think it's part of his project. He used to explain these things to me, but I didn't understand everything back then. Jake leaned back, rubbing his temples. If we could figure out what this is, it might help us understand why they're after you and him. Ava hesitated, then pulled something out of her backpack, a small notebook with a worn leather cover. I forgot I had this, she said. It's my dad's journal. He gave it to me the night he disappeared. Jake's eyes widened. What's in it? I don't know, Ava admitted. I never opened it. I was scared of what I might find. Jake gently took the journal and opened it. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and cryptic phrases. One entry stood out. The Aurora Protocol is more than energy. It's the key to everything. Ava must be protected at all costs. If I don't return, she knows enough to find me. Jake's heart sank as he read the words aloud. Ava's expression shifted from confusion to determination. He wanted me to find him, she said. I have to try. The next morning, Michael arrived at the cabin, his expression grim. I've been digging, he said as he sat down at the small table. Your friend Dr. Harris was onto something huge, and a big corporation named Novodyne is at the center of it. Novodyne? Jake asked. They fund cutting-edge research, but their reputation isn't clean. They've been accused of unethical practices, even making people disappear. If they're after Ava, it's because they think she's the key to finding her father or whatever he was working on. Ava sat quietly, absorbing every word. My dad didn't trust them, she said. He said they only cared about power. Michael nodded. He was right. If you want to find him, you're going to have to dig deeper. But that means putting yourselves at even greater risk. Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. So what's the move? Michael hesitated. You have two options. Go off the grid, entirely disappear until this blows over. Or follow the trail, confront Novodyne, and try to find Dr. Harris. The room fell silent. Ava's small voice broke the tension. I want to find my dad. Jake looked at her, the determination in her eyes unmistakable. Ava, it's dangerous, he said softly. If we do this, we'll be putting ourselves right in their sights. I don't care, she said firmly. He didn't give up on me. I won't give up on him. Jake sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He turned to Michael. If we go after Novodyne, what's our next step? Michael pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. There's a former employee, someone who worked closely with Dr. Harris. Name's Lydia Moore. She was fired when she tried to blow the whistle on some of Novodyne's practices. If anyone knows where Harris is or what's really going on, it's her. That night, Jake sat outside the cabin, staring at the stars. Ava joined him, her small frame wrapped in a blanket. Are you scared? She asked. Yeah, Jake admitted, but I'm more scared of what'll happen if we don't do anything. Ava nodded, her gaze fixed on the sky. My dad used to say the stars were like numbers, endless, but full of patterns if you looked hard enough. Jake smiled faintly. Sounds like he was a smart man. He was, Ava said quietly, and I miss him. Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll find him, Ava, whatever it takes, as the forest around them whispered with the wind. Jake made a silent promise. No matter the cost, he would protect Ava and uncover the truth. The address Michael had given them was in a run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The walls were cracked, and the faint smell of dampness lingered in the air. Jake and Ava exchanged a glance as they climbed the narrow staircase. Jake could sense Ava's apprehension, but there was also a flicker of hope in her blue eyes. This is it, Jake said, stopping in front of apartment 3B. He knocked twice, his knuckles scraping against the peeling paint. For a moment, there was silence. Then the sound of footsteps approached the door. It creaked open just enough for a woman to peer through. Her dark brown eyes were cautious, and her face, framed by graying curls, bore the lines of someone who had seen too much. Lydia Moore. Jake asked. Who's asking? She replied, her tone guarded. My name's Jake, and this is Ava, he said, stepping slightly to the side so she could see the girl. We're looking for answers about her father, Dr. William Harris. At the mention of the name, Lydia's expression shifted. She opened the door fully, revealing a small, cluttered apartment. Come in, she said, stepping aside. Quickly, inside the apartment was a mess of papers, books, and electronic equipment. Ava's eyes darted around the room, taking in the chaotic space, while Jake remained focused on Lydia. Why are you looking for Harris? She asked, crossing her arms. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? We know, Jake said firmly, but Ava's his daughter, and she's in danger. We found some of his research, and we think it's tied to Novodyne. We were told you could help us. Lydia's eyes softened as she looked at Ava. You really are his daughter, she murmured. You have his eyes. Ava stepped forward. Do you know where he is? Lydia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't, she admitted. But I know why they're after you. She gestured for them to sit at a small table, pushing aside a stack of papers to make room. William and I worked on the Aurora Protocol together, she began. It wasn't just about energy. It was about creating a self-sustaining system that could revolutionize the world. But Novodyne had other plans. They wanted to weaponize it to use it as leverage over governments and economies. Ava listened intently, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. My dad wouldn't let them. No, he wouldn't, Lydia said with a faint smile. That's why he disappeared. He wanted to keep the Aurora Protocol out of their hand. And he trusted you, Ava, to help protect it. Ava's brows furrowed. Why me? Because he knew they wouldn't stop, Lydia said, her voice heavy. He must have left you something, a clue, a key to finishing what he started. Jake pulled out the journal and unfolded the map they had found in the lab. We found these, he said, sliding them across the table. The journal mentions Ava as the key to something. Lydia's eyes scanned the pages, her expression growing serious. These aren't just notes, she said. They're instructions. Harris must have hidden the core of the Aurora Protocol somewhere safe, and he left a way for Ava to find it. As they deciphered the journal together, Lydia explained more about Novodyne's reach. They'll stop at nothing to find the protocol, she warned. They have people everywhere, private investigators, informants, even law enforcement. So, how do we stay ahead of them? Jake asked. Lydia hesitated. You'll need to be smart and fast. And you'll need allies. Jake thought of Michael, grateful for his help, but realizing it might not be enough. Do you think they've tracked us here? He asked. They might have, Lydia admitted. But you can't let that stop you. If they get their hands on this. She tapped the journal. It's over. Just as they were packing up to leave, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Lydia froze, her eyes widening in fear. Stay quiet, she whispered, motioning for Ava to hide under the table. Jake moved to the door, peering through the peephole. Two men in dark suits stood outside, their expressions grim. It's them, Jake said quietly, his voice tense. Lydia grabbed a small device from the table and handed it to Ava. This is a tracker, she said hurriedly. If anything happens to me, use it to find the final location. It'll guide you to the core. Ava's hands trembled as she took the device. What about you? I'll be fine, Lydia said, forcing a smile. Just get out of here. The men started pounding on the door. Jake and Ava slipped out the back window into the alley below, Lydia staying behind to stall the intruders. As they ran down the narrow passage, Ava clutched the tracker tightly, her breath coming in short gasps. Will she be okay? Ava asked, her voice breaking. Jake didn't answer. He didn't know. When they finally reached the truck, Jake started the engine and sped away, his mind racing. Lydia's words echoed in his head. You'll need allies. He glanced at Ava, who sat silently, the tracker clutched in her lap. We'll finish this, he said firmly, his jaw set. No matter what it takes. Ava nodded, her determination matching his. They might have left Lydia behind, but they wouldn't abandon the fight. As the tracker blinked faintly in Ava's hand, Jake knew their next move was clear. They had to find the core of the Aurora Protocol before Novodyne did. Time was running out. The truck roared down the empty highway, the faint glow of the tracker pulsing in Ava's hands like a heartbeat. Jake kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly as his mind churned with questions. Lydia's warning replayed in his head. If they get their hands on this, it's over. Where does it lead? Jake asked, his voice steady but tense. Ava stared at the blinking light on the device, her small fingers tracing its edges. It's pointing west, but it doesn't say exactly where. Just a direction. Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. We'll figure it out. Whatever's at the end of that signal, it's the key to everything. The tracker guided them through winding roads and desolate landscapes until they reached the outskirts of a remote mountain range. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Jake pulled the truck into a clearing, killing the engine. This is as far as we go by car, he said, stepping out and grabbing a flashlight. Ava followed, her small frame dwarfed by the looming mountain. She looked up at Jake, her blue eyes filled with determination. "I'm ready," she said. The trail was steep and treacherous, but the blinking light of the tracker kept them moving forward. As darkness fell, Jake's flashlight illuminated a narrow path carved into the rock. Ava stumbled once, but Jake caught her arm, steadying her. "We're close," she said, her voice breathless but unwavering. "I can feel it." The blinking light grew faster as they approached the entrance of a hidden cave. Jake pushed aside the thick foliage obscuring the entrance, revealing a rusted metal door embedded in the rock. A keypad glowed faintly next to it, the numbers eerily familiar. Ava stepped forward, her fingers hovering over the keypad. "It's the same code," she whispered. "Do it," Jake urged, his voice low. Ava typed the numbers, 1204-1537. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor leading into the depths of the mountain. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the cavern. At the end of the corridor, they found a room bathed in soft blue light. In the center was a sleek metallic console, surrounded by monitors and wires. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. "This is it," Ava said, her voice filled with awe. "This is the Aurora Protocol." Jake approached the console cautiously. "What does it do?" he asked. Ava hesitated, then reached into her backpack, pulling out her father's journal. She flipped through the pages until she found a diagram matching the console. "It's a core," she explained. "It generates energy, clean, limitless energy. My dad said it could power entire cities without harming the environment." Jake let out a low whistle. "No wonder Novodyne wants it. But it's more than that," Ava continued, her voice trembling. "It's connected to the grid. If Novodyne takes it, they can control everything: power, communication, even defense systems. That's why my dad hid it." As they studied the console, a sound from the entrance made Jake's blood run cold. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by faint voices. "They found us," he said, his voice tense. He grabbed Ava's arm, pulling her behind the console. "Stay low." The first figure appeared in the doorway, a flashlight cutting through the dim light. Jake recognized the suit and the cold, professional demeanor. It was Novodyne's men. At least 3 of them, armed and searching. Ava clutched the journal to her chest, her breath shallow. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jake's mind raced. He scanned the room, spotting a panel on the console labeled "System Shutdown." "Ava, can you disable it? Make it useless to them?" She hesitated, her hands trembling. "I think so, but it might erase everything." "Do it," Jake urged. "It's the only way to keep it out of their hands." Ava moved to the console, her fingers flying over the buttons as she entered the override code from her father's journal. The monitors flashed red, and the hum of the machine began to fade. The men reached the room just as the system powered down. "Step away," one of them barked, his gun trained on Jake. Jake raised his hands, stepping in front of Ava. "You're too late," he said, his voice steady. "It's gone." The man's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you've done." "I know enough." Jake shot back. The tension in the room was palpable as the men realized the core was useless. One of them cursed under his breath, lowering his weapon. "We'll deal with you later," he said, motioning for the others to leave. Jake waited until the footsteps faded before collapsing against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ava turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "I erased it," she said, her voice shaking. "It's gone." Jake pulled her into a hug. "You did the right thing," he said. "Your dad would be proud." As they left the cave, the first light of dawn broke over the mountain. The danger wasn't over, but Jake knew they had taken a crucial step. Novodyne might still come after them, but they no longer held the power they sought. For the first time in days, Ava smiled faintly. "We stopped them," she said. Jake nodded. "Yeah, we did. But we're not done yet. We still have to find your dad." Hand in hand, they made their way back down the mountain, the promise of a new fight ahead, but with hope burning brighter than ever. The air was still and quiet as Jake and Ava descended the mountain. The sun's golden light painted the landscape with a sense of calm that neither of them could fully embrace. Though the Aurora Protocol was safe from Novodyne's grasp, the looming question of Dr. Harris's whereabouts still hung heavily between them. "Do you think they'll come after us again?" Ava asked, breaking the silence. Jake glanced down at her, his jaw tightening. "Probably," he admitted, "but now they've lost what they wanted most." "That gives us some time," Ava nodded, clutching her father's journal tightly. "I just want to find him." "We will," Jake said firmly. One step at a time. Their first stop after leaving the mountains was a small town a few hours away. Michael had arranged a temporary safe house for them, a modest cottage surrounded by dense trees. Inside, they found a basic setup: 2 beds, a small kitchen, and enough supplies to last them a few weeks. As they settled in, Jake's phone buzzed with a call from Michael. "How'd it go?" Michael asked without preamble. "We shut it down," Jake replied. "They can't use the Aurora Protocol anymore." Michael let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a move. But you know this isn't over, right?" "I know," Jake said. "We need to find Harris before they regroup." Michael hesitated. "I might have something." A contact in the research community mentioned a facility overseas that matches Harris's work. "It's risky, but it could be where he's hiding or where they're keeping him. Send me the details," Jake said, his resolve hardening. The next few days were spent planning. With Michael's help, Jake and Ava pieced together a trail that led to a secluded research compound in Eastern Europe. The journey would be dangerous, but Ava's determination never wavered. "This is it," she said one evening, tracing a line on the map. "If my dad's alive, he'll be here." Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then that's where we'll go." Their departure was quiet, under the cover of darkness. Jake arranged for forged documents and discreet transportation, ensuring they wouldn't be easily tracked. Ava's resilience amazed him. Despite her young age, she carried herself with a strength far beyond her years. The journey was long and grueling, but when they arrived at the compound, the sight before them took Jake's breath away. It was a sprawling facility hidden deep within a forest, its stark white walls gleaming under the moonlight. Security was tight, with guards patrolling the perimeter. "How do we get in?" Ava whispered. Jake studied the facility, his mind racing. "We'll find a way." Stay close, under the cover of night. They navigated the dense forest surrounding the compound. Using the journal's cryptic notes, they found a maintenance tunnel leading inside. Jake's heart pounded as they crept through the dimly lit corridors, every sound amplified by the silence. Finally, they reached a room that matched one of the sketches in the journal. Inside, they found a figure hunched over a desk, illuminated by the glow of monitors. "Dad," Ava cried, rushing forward. Dr. William Harris turned, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "Ava," he said, his voice breaking. "How did you?" Jake stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. "We've been looking for you." "Ava's been through hell to get here." Harris pulled Ava into a tight embrace, his hands trembling. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. The reunion was brief. Harris explained that he had been forced to continue his work under Novodyne's surveillance, but had been leaving clues in the hope that Ava would find him. "I knew you'd figure it out," he said, looking at her with pride. "We need to leave," Jake said. "Now," Harris nodded, gathering a small drive from his desk. "This contains everything proof of what Novodyne's done and how to stop them for good." As they made their way back through the tunnels, alarms blared. Guards flooded the compound, their shouts echoing through the halls. Jake led the way, his determination unwavering. The escape was chaotic, but successful. With Harris reunited with Ava and the drive in hand, they left the compound behind, their mission far from over, but their family whole again. Weeks later, Jake watched as Ava and her father stood in front of a group of reporters, exposing Novodyne's crimes to the world. The documents on the drive sparked a global investigation, dismantling the corporation's hold on power. Jake stood at the edge of the crowd, a faint smile on his face. He had done his part, and now it was time to step back. As Ava caught his eye, she ran over and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. Jake knelt down, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You're a fighter, Ava." Your dad's lucky to have you, so am I, she said, her eyes shining. As Jake walked away, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the world was a little brighter, thanks to a young girl's courage and a father's love. What lesson did this incredible story bring to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to Golden Stories and give it a like. Every story we share is crafted with dedication and care, with the goal of touching each of your hearts. Your support makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing you more special content. Thank you for being with us, and see you next time.